They laughed when the lawyer handed him a single dollar, but before the sun rose the next morning, that same dollar would open a door no one else in the room even knew existed. The conference room atop Whitmore and Hale law offices carried the scent of polished oak, old money, and quiet confidence. Beyond the floor-to-soiling windows, snow drifted across the Montana skyline in slow white curtains, softening the distant outline of the Bitterroot Mountains. Inside, warmth filled the room, but it did little to soften the expressions gathered around the long table. Wyatt Brooks sat near the end, broad shoulders framed by a weathered denim jacket that had seen many winters. At 40 years old, he carried himself with the quiet discipline of a man who had spent years serving something larger than himself. His dark brown hair showed faint traces of silver near the temples, and his blue-gray eyes remained calm despite the tension hanging in the air. At his feet rested Shadow, a 6-year-old German shepherd whose black and tan coat gleamed beneath the chandelier's warm light. The dog lay perfectly still, ears alert, amber eyes slowly moving across the room. Shadow had once served beside soldiers, and although years had passed, he still possessed the habit of watching everything. Across the table sat the Whitmore family. Logan Whitmore leaned back comfortably in an expensive leather chair, his tailored suit fitting him as naturally as arrogance fit his smile. Beside him sat his sister Natalie, elegant and composed, scrolling through messages on her phone with the detached confidence of someone who had never doubted how the day would end. Around them sat relatives, advisors, and beneficiaries, each waiting to hear how Harold Whitmore's fortune would be divided. Harold had built an empire from timber and land. His name was known across Montana. More importantly, he had been one of the few people who never treated Wyatt like a man who had fallen behind in life. During Harold's final years, while illness slowly stole his strength, Wyatt had spent countless afternoons helping him around the property, sharing coffee on quiet porches, and listening to stories that stretched back generations. Yet Wyatt expected nothing today. Life had already taught him not to expect rewards for doing what was right. Daniel Reeves adjusted his glasses and opened the thick binder before him. His voice carried the calm precision of a man trusted with important truths. One by one, properties, investments, and company shares were distributed. Millions of dollars changed hands through carefully written paragraphs. Logan's smile widened. Natalie barely looked up from her phone. Wyatt remained silent. Shadow rested his head on his paws. Then Reeves turned another page. His expression shifted slightly. The room grew quieter. To Wyatt Brooks, he read. Several heads turned. Logan's grin sharpened. Natalie folded her arms. Reeves continued. In recognition of his loyalty, kindness, and service during my final years, I leave Wyatt Brooks the sum of $1 US. Silence settled for a heartbeat. Then laughter broke across the room. Logan laughed first. Others followed. Not loudly, but enough. Enough to fill the room with embarrassment they assumed Wyatt should feel. Reeves reached into his jacket and placed a crisp $1 bill on the polished table. It slid gently across the surface until it stopped directly in front of Wyatt. Shadow immediately lifted his head. The German shepherd stared at the bill. His ears rose. His eyes narrowed slightly. Wyatt noticed but said nothing. Around the room, smiles spread. Logan leaned forward. Well, he said with a chuckle, I guess loyalty pays better than I thought. More laughter followed. Natalie offered a thin smile that somehow felt colder than the jokes. Wyatt looked down at the dollar. For several long seconds, he simply studied it. Then he picked it up carefully and folded it once. The room waited for anger, disappointment, or humiliation. Instead, Wyatt slipped the bill into his jacket pocket and slowly rose to his feet. Shadow stood beside him. The dog's gaze lingered on the people laughing before returning to Wyatt. Thank you for your time, Wyatt said quietly. His voice remained steady. Then he turned and walked toward the door. The laughter faded behind him as he disappeared into the hallway. But inside the conference room, no one noticed that Shadow glanced back one final time toward the table, his ears still alert, as though something about that simple dollar bill felt very wrong or very important. The drive back to Wyatt's cabin felt longer than usual. Snow drifted across the narrow Montana roads, glowing beneath the truck's headlights like pale ghosts crossing the darkness. Wyatt kept one hand on the steering wheel, while the other rested near his jacket pocket, where the folded dollar bill remained. Shadow sat upright in the passenger seat, unusually alert. Every few minutes, the German shepherd glanced toward Wyatt's pocket, and then toward the road ahead. You are acting strange tonight, buddy, Wyatt said quietly. It is just $1. Shadow responded with a low huff and returned his attention to the darkness outside. 20 minutes later, they reached the small cabin tucked against a stand of pine trees. The porch light cast a warm circle onto the snow-covered ground. Wyatt stepped inside and tossed his keys onto the kitchen counter. The familiar scent of cedar wood and coffee grounds welcomed him home. "At least they cannot take this place too," he muttered. Shadow immediately moved toward the chair beside the fireplace where Wyatt had hung his jacket. The dog stood there staring. Wyatt raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" Shadow nudged the jacket with his nose, then again and again. Wyatt walked over and pulled the folded bill from the pocket. "You mean this?" Shadow's ears lifted. The dog stared at the bill without blinking. Wyatt laughed softly. "You are telling me a piece of paper is important." He unfolded it beneath the kitchen light. George Washington stared back exactly as before. Nothing unusual, no markings, no notes, no hidden message, just a crisp $1 bill. Yet Shadow remained focused. Wyatt placed it on the table. The dog stepped closer and sniffed carefully before letting out a soft whine. "Well, Harold always did enjoy riddles," Wyatt said. The words lingered in the quiet room. For a moment he remembered sitting on Harold Whitmore's porch months earlier. The old man had been wrapped in a blanket, watching the mountains disappear beneath an orange sunset. "People spend their whole lives looking at things without seeing them," Harold had said. "The secret is usually hiding in plain sight." At the time, Wyatt had assumed it was another one of Harold's philosophical observations. Tonight the memory felt different. He stared at the dollar again. Snow tapped gently against the windows. The fire crackled. The cabin settled into silence. Around midnight, Wyatt finally turned off the lights and headed toward his bedroom. Shadow followed but stopped halfway down the hall. Wyatt noticed immediately. "Come on," the dog did not move. Instead, he returned to the kitchen table and sat beside the dollar bill. "You have got to be kidding me." Shadow remained planted. Wyatt sighed. "Fine, guard the national treasure." He shook his head and went to bed. Several hours later, he woke suddenly. A sound echoed through the cabin, not loud. Just enough to pull him from sleep. Tap, tap, tap. Wyatt sat upright. Moonlight filtered through the bedroom window. Another tap followed. He stepped into the hallway and saw Shadow standing beside the front door, ears forward, body tense. Then came a third knock, slow, deliberate. Someone was outside long before sunrise. Wyatt opened the door and a gust of icy air swept into the cabin. Snowflakes drifted beneath the porch light, spinning through the darkness. Standing on the steps was Daniel Reeves. The attorney looked older than he had the day before. His gray overcoat was dusted with snow, and a leather briefcase rested beneath one arm. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Reeves glanced down at Shadow. The German shepherd stood perfectly still, watching him with unwavering focus. "I apologize for the hour," Reeves said quietly. But Harold's instructions were very specific. Wyatt folded his arms. "You drove 3 hours before sunrise because of instructions?" "I did." Reeves looked directly at him. "May I come in?" A few minutes later, they sat at the kitchen table. The fire crackled softly, while steam rose from 2 mugs of coffee. Shadow remained beside Wyatt's chair, his eyes moving between the attorney and the folded dollar bill still resting on the table. Reeves noticed. "Interesting." "What is?" Wyatt asked. "The dog keeps watching the bill." Wyatt leaned back. "He has been doing that all night." Reeves stared at the dollar for several seconds before speaking. Harold believed Shadow would notice before anyone else. Wyatt frowned. "Notice what?" Reeves opened his briefcase and removed a sealed envelope. Across the front, written in Harold Whitmore's unmistakable handwriting, were 5 words. "For Wyatt Brooks, if alone." The sight of the handwriting tightened something inside Wyatt's chest. "Harold left that?" Reeves nodded. "He instructed me not to deliver it unless 3 conditions were met." "Which were?" "First, the will had to be read. Second, you had to accept the dollar. Third, you had to leave without asking a single question." Wyatt stared at him. "That is oddly specific." Harold was an oddly specific man. For the first time, a faint smile crossed Reeves's face. Wyatt carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The message was short. "Wyatt, if you are reading this, then you passed the test. Most people see value only when it is announced to them. I needed to know whether you still saw value when none appeared to exist. Bring the dollar. Trust Daniel. Follow the road into the mountains. The rest belongs to you now." Wyatt read the letter twice, then a third time. "That is it?" Reeves nodded. "That is all he left?" "Not quite." The attorney reached into his briefcase again and unfolded an old map. The paper looked decades old. Faded lines crossed the mountains west of Missoula. One location had been marked with a red circle. Wyatt felt his pulse quicken. "What is that place?" Reeves rolled the map closed. "That is what Harold wanted you to discover for yourself." Shadow suddenly rose to his feet. The dog walked to the window and stared into the snowy darkness beyond the glass. His ears stood high. His body had become rigid. Reeves followed the movement. "He knows we are going somewhere." Wyatt gave a skeptical laugh. "He is a dog, perhaps." Reeves stood and picked up his coat. Or perhaps Harold was right about more things than either of us realized. Outside, dawn was beginning to color the eastern horizon. Pale blue light touched the snow-covered pines. Reeves looked toward the mountains barely visible in the distance. "We need to leave now," he said. "The drive will take nearly 4 hours." Wyatt picked up the dollar and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Shadow immediately moved to the door, waiting, ready, as though he had been expecting this journey all along. The black SUV climbed steadily into the Bitterroot Mountains as dawn spread across the horizon. Snow-covered ridges glowed pale gold beneath the first sunlight, and long shadows stretched across the valleys below. Wyatt sat quietly in the passenger seat while Shadow occupied the back seat, unusually restless. Every few minutes the German shepherd stood, pressed his nose against the window, then sat again. Daniel Reeves noticed. "He has been doing that for nearly an hour." Wyatt glanced over his shoulder. "He usually sleeps during road trips, not today." The attorney tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "Harold used to say that animals notice things long before people do." Wyatt looked out at the mountains rolling past. "Harold said a lot of things." Reeves smiled faintly. "Most of them sounded strange until later." The road narrowed as they climbed higher. Pine forests surrounded them on both sides. Snow clung to every branch, turning the landscape into a silent world of white and green. After another 30 miles, Reeves reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small photograph. He handed it to Wyatt. The picture showed Harold standing beside an old wooden cabin. The photograph had faded with age, but the structure was still visible. Weathered logs, stone chimney, a dark green roof. "Where was this taken?" Wyatt asked. "That is where we are going." "Harold owned a cabin out here." "Officially, no." Wyatt frowned. "What does that mean?" Reeves kept his eyes on the road. "It means Harold spent 40 years hiding certain things from people he did not trust." Silence settled between them. Outside, the mountains seemed endless. Then Shadow suddenly barked once, a sharp sound, not aggressive, alert. Wyatt turned immediately. "What is it, boy?" The dog remained standing. His ears were forward, his gaze fixed on something ahead. Reeves slowed the vehicle. Around the next bend, a rusted gate emerged from the trees. Most of it was hidden beneath snowdrifts. A faded sign leaned sideways beside the entrance. The lettering had nearly vanished. "That was not on the map," Wyatt said. "No," Reeves replied quietly. "It was never supposed to be." He parked beside the gate and stepped out. The cold mountain air hit them instantly. Wyatt followed while Shadow jumped from the SUV and moved ahead, nose low to the ground. Snow crunched beneath their boots. Beyond the gate, an old road disappeared into the forest. Trees crowded both sides, forming a narrow corridor that seemed untouched by time. Shadow suddenly stopped. His body stiffened. Then he began pulling forward. "Easy," Wyatt said, but the dog continued moving, not running, leading. Reeves stared after him. "That is exactly what Harold described." Wyatt looked at him. "What are you talking about?" The attorney reached into his briefcase and unfolded a yellowed piece of paper. One of Harold's notes. He cleared his throat and read aloud. "When the shepherd begins to lead, follow him. The path will reveal itself." Wyatt stared at the words, then at Shadow, then back at the note. "You are telling me Harold wrote instructions involving my dog?" 3 years ago, a cold wind swept through the pines. Somewhere deeper in the forest, a branch creaked. Shadow looked back toward them and gave a single impatient bark. For the first time since Harold's funeral, Wyatt felt something unfamiliar stirring beneath the weight of grief and confusion. Not certainty, not understanding, hope, and somewhere beyond the trees, hidden beneath decades of secrets, something was waiting for them. Shadow moved ahead through the snow-covered trail as if he had walked it before. The narrow road twisted between towering pines, their branches heavy with fresh snow that glittered beneath the morning sun. Wyatt followed a few yards behind while Daniel Reeves struggled to keep pace. The deeper they traveled, the quieter the forest became. Even the wind seemed reluctant to disturb the silence. After nearly half a mile, the trees began to thin. Then Wyatt saw it. The cabin stood at the edge of a frozen clearing, weathered by decades of mountain winters. Thick logs formed the walls. A stone chimney rose from one side. Frost covered the windows like pale lace. For several seconds, nobody spoke. "This place is older than I expected," Wyatt finally said. Reeves nodded. "Harold purchased the property in 1983. Wyatt looked at him. "You said nobody knew about it." "Nobody did." Shadow suddenly trotted toward the porch. His tail remained low, but his pace quickened. Wyatt climbed the wooden steps behind him. The boards creaked softly beneath their weight. A rusted brass lock hung from the front door. Reeves reached into his coat pocket and produced a small key. "Harold gave me this 20 years ago." Wyatt stared at it. 20 years? He told me one day I would know who deserved it." The lock clicked open. The door swung inward. Cold air drifted from the darkness inside. Dust covered nearly every surface, yet something about the cabin felt preserved rather than abandoned. Wyatt stepped through the doorway. Shadow immediately moved from room to room, sniffing carefully. Sunlight filtered through the windows, illuminating shelves lined with books, framed photographs, and old wooden furniture. A stone fireplace dominated the main room. Above it hung a photograph of Harold Whitmore as a much younger man. Beside him stood three unfamiliar people and a younger version of Wyatt's father. Wyatt froze. That cannot be right. Reeves stepped closer. What is it? Wyatt pointed at the picture. My father. Reeves stared at the photograph. I have never seen that before. Wyatt slowly lifted the frame from the wall. On the back, written in faded ink, were four names: Harold Whitmore, Thomas Brooks, Samuel Reed, Michael Carter. Wyatt swallowed hard. Thomas Brooks was his father, a man who had passed away many years earlier. Why would Harold keep this hidden? He asked. Reeves remained silent. Before either man could say more, Shadow barked sharply from the far corner of the room. They turned. The German shepherd stood beside an old wooden desk. His paw rested against the bottom drawer. You found something? Wyatt walked over and pulled the drawer open. Inside lay a leather-bound journal, several folded maps, and a sealed envelope. Across the front were 7 handwritten words. Open only when the cabin is found. The room suddenly felt smaller. Wyatt exchanged a glance with Reeves. How many secrets did Harold actually leave behind? Reeves looked toward the frozen mountains outside the window. I am beginning to think we have only uncovered the first one. Wyatt carefully broke the seal on the envelope, while Shadow sat beside the desk, watching every movement. The paper inside crackled softly as he unfolded it. Harold's handwriting filled the page. Strong, precise, familiar. Wyatt began reading aloud. If you are standing inside this cabin, then you have already proven something most people never will. You chose dignity when humiliation would have been easier. You chose loyalty when betrayal offered rewards. That is why you are here. The room fell silent. Even the wind outside seemed to pause. Reeves listened without interruption. Wyatt continued. Everything hidden in these mountains began with 4 men. We made a promise 40 years ago. One of those men was your father. Wyatt lowered the page. My father never mentioned Harold. Reeves nodded toward the journal. Maybe the answer is in there. Wyatt opened the leather-bound journal. The first pages contained photographs, handwritten notes, and old survey maps. As he turned the pages, a story slowly emerged. 4 young men had pooled their savings decades earlier to purchase forgotten timber rights, remote parcels of land, and abandoned mining leases that larger companies ignored. Harold had managed the investments. The others had trusted him. Wyatt stopped at a photograph showing his father standing beside Harold near a mountain ridge. Both men looked young. Both were smiling. I have never seen this picture before, Wyatt said quietly. Then something caught his attention. Several pages contained detailed property records, parcel after parcel, acre after acre. Hundreds of locations scattered across western Montana. Wyatt looked up. These cannot all belong to Harold. Reeves adjusted his glasses. Technically, they belong to a private partnership. And the partnership still exists? Apparently. Shadow suddenly stood. His ears lifted. The dog walked toward the stone fireplace and began sniffing along the base. Wyatt glanced over. What now? Shadow ignored him. His nose moved carefully across the stones, then he scratched once. Stopped, scratched again. Reeves slowly smiled. That dog is becoming predictable. Wyatt walked over and knelt beside the fireplace. One stone looked slightly different from the others, less worn, cleaner. He pressed against it. Nothing happened. He pushed harder. A soft click echoed from somewhere inside the wall. Both men froze. You heard that? Wyatt asked. I definitely heard that. A narrow section of wood paneling beside the fireplace shifted outward by several inches. Hidden behind it was a small compartment. Inside sat a metal lockbox. Wyatt carefully removed it and set it on the table. The box was heavy, far heavier than its size suggested. Attached to the handle was a folded note. Wyatt opened it. The message contained only a single sentence. The key has been with you since yesterday. Reeves looked immediately toward Wyatt's jacket. So did Shadow. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then realization appeared across Wyatt's face. He slowly reached into his pocket and removed the $1 bill. His pulse quickened. Along the edge of the bill, nearly invisible beneath the fold, was a tiny brass key secured within the paper itself. Wyatt stared at it in disbelief. Reeves exhaled softly. My goodness. Shadow wagged his tail once, as if he had known all along. Wyatt carefully removed the hidden key and inserted it into the lockbox. The lock clicked open. Inside were dozens of legal documents, stock certificates, partnership agreements, and one thick folder marked with a date from 38 years earlier. Reeves opened the first page and immediately fell silent. Wyatt watched his expression change. What is it? Reeves looked up slowly. Wyatt, I think we have just discovered why Harold kept all of this hidden from his own family. Reeves carefully lowered himself into a chair and spread the documents across the table. Sunlight filtered through the frosted windows, casting pale bands of light over papers that had remained hidden for decades. Wyatt studied the attorney's face. You look like you have seen a ghost. Reeves removed his glasses. Not a ghost, a strategy. He tapped one of the documents. Harold was planning something for nearly 40 years. Wyatt pulled a chair closer. Shadow settled beside him, though the dog's eyes remained fixed on the folder. Reeves opened the first file. Inside were partnership records signed by Harold Whitmore, Thomas Brooks, Samuel Reed, and Michael Carter. Each page revealed additional land purchases, timber holdings, mineral rights, and investment accounts stretching across multiple counties. Wyatt stared at the growing stack. This is far larger than a few forgotten properties. Much larger, Reeves agreed. These assets were never merged into Whitmore Timber. Why not? Reeves slid another document across the table. Because Harold did not trust what the company would eventually become. Wyatt frowned. You mean Logan? Reeves nodded slowly. Years ago, Harold became concerned that future leadership would focus only on profit. He wanted a separate legacy protected from corporate control. Silence filled the room. Snow drifted beyond the windows. The mountain stood motionless beneath the winter sky. Wyatt turned another page and froze. A handwritten note rested between two legal agreements. The paper had yellowed with age. The handwriting belonged to his father, Thomas Brooks. Wyatt's chest tightened as he read the words. If anything happens to me, Harold knows what to do. Protect the partnership, protect the promise, protect the future. Wyatt lowered the note. For several seconds he could not speak. I have not seen my father's handwriting in years. Reeves remained quiet. Some moments deserved silence. Shadow rested his head gently against Wyatt's leg. The simple gesture pulled him back to the present. He reached down and scratched behind the dog's ears. Thanks, buddy. Suddenly, Shadow lifted his head. His ears stood forward. He walked toward a bookshelf across the room. Wyatt noticed immediately. There he goes again. The German Shepherd stopped beside the shelf and stared. Then he nudged the lower section with his nose. Reeves chuckled softly. At this point, I trust him more than any map. Wyatt walked over and examined the shelf. Most of the books looked untouched. One volume sat slightly farther back than the others. He pulled it free. A metallic click echoed from inside the wall. Both men exchanged a glance. Another one? Wyatt asked. A narrow compartment opened behind the shelf. Inside rested a single sealed envelope and a small cassette recorder. Reeves looked genuinely surprised. I was never told about this. Wyatt picked up the envelope. Across the front were 8 handwritten words. Open only after finding the partnership records. He slowly opened it and unfolded the letter inside. The first line immediately stole the air from the room. Wyatt, if you are reading this, then Logan has already received exactly what I intended him to receive. Wyatt looked up. Reeves stared back. Neither man spoke. Then Wyatt continued reading. With every sentence, Harold's true plan became clearer. And somewhere hundreds of miles away, Logan Whitmore still believed he had won. Wyatt continued reading Harold's letter while the cabin remained silent except for the soft crackling of the fire. Logan inherited exactly what he spent his life chasing, Wyatt read aloud. Control, titles, public recognition. But those things were never the most valuable assets. Reeves leaned forward. Keep going. Wyatt turned the page. The partnership was never designed to create wealth alone. It was created to preserve opportunity. Over 4 decades, the holdings expanded beyond land and timber. The assets were placed into trusts, private investments, conservation agreements, and development rights. Their purpose was always to benefit future generations. Wyatt slowly lowered the paper. How much are we talking about? Reeves opened several documents and began reviewing numbers. His eyes widened, then widened again. Harold was far more successful than anyone realized. That does not answer the question. Reeves looked directly at him. The estimated value exceeds $50 million. Wyatt stared at him. For a moment he thought he had misheard. 50 million? At minimum. The words hung in the air. Wyatt glanced around the old cabin, the worn furniture, the photographs, the journals. Nothing about the room suggested such a number. Shadow rested quietly beside the table as though none of it mattered. Reeves opened another folder. There is more. Wyatt laughed softly. There is always more. The attorney handed him a document. Harold named a successor trustee. Wyatt scanned the page. His name appeared at the bottom. Me? Reeves nodded. You. Why? Reeves smiled. Because Harold spent years testing people. According to these notes, Every time he offered someone influence, they wanted more. Every time he offered you something, you tried to give it away. Wyatt shook his head. That is not a qualification. Apparently Harold thought it was. A sudden sound interrupted them. Shadow stood and walked toward the cassette recorder hidden inside the compartment. The German shepherd nudged it with his nose. Wyatt picked it up. You think there is something on this? Reeves examined the recorder. Only one way to find out. After several moments, they found fresh batteries inside a nearby drawer. Wyatt pressed play. Static filled the room. Then Harold's voice emerged. Older, slower, but unmistakably his. If you are hearing this, then Shadow found the recorder before you did. Wyatt laughed despite himself. Reeves smiled. Harold continued. Wyatt, if you made it this far, then you finally understand that this was never about money. Your father believed character was the only inheritance that could not be stolen. I spent 40 years proving him right. Wyatt listened quietly. The properties, the accounts, the trusts, they belong to the partnership now, and the partnership belongs to you. Not because you earned wealth, because you never chased it. The recording ended. Silence returned. Snow drifted beyond the windows while sunlight reflected across the mountains. Reeves slowly closed the folders. We should return to town tomorrow. Wyatt nodded. Why tomorrow? Because once these documents are filed, everyone is going to learn the truth. Wyatt looked down at Shadow. The German shepherd's tail moved once against the wooden floor. Somehow the dog seemed perfectly content, as if the greatest discovery was not what had been found inside the cabin, but what had been revealed inside the people Harold had chosen to trust. The following afternoon, Wyatt and Reeves returned to town, carrying the documents that had remained hidden for nearly 4 decades. Snow still covered the streets, but the sky above Montana had cleared into a brilliant blue. Inside the law office, the atmosphere felt very different from the day of the will reading. Logan Whitmore sat at the conference table with the confidence of a man who believed everything was already settled. Natalie sat beside him, reviewing paperwork. Several advisors filled the room. The moment Wyatt entered with Shadow at his side, conversation stopped. Logan leaned back in his chair and smiled. Back already? Wyatt said nothing. Reeves placed a thick stack of folders onto the table. The sound echoed through the room. Logan's smile faded slightly. What is all this? Reeves opened the first file. Additional estate documents authorized by Harold Whitmore. Natalie frowned. There were no additional estate documents. Reeves calmly adjusted his glasses. There were. You simply were never informed about them. For the next hour, documents were reviewed one by one. Property records, partnership agreements, trust accounts, investment holdings, historical contracts. Each page revealed another piece of the truth. Logan's confidence slowly disappeared. Natalie stopped taking notes. By the end, the room had fallen completely silent. That is impossible, Logan finally said. My father would never hide this from us. Reeves slid Harold's letter across the table. He anticipated that response. Logan read the letter. His face tightened. Then he read it again, this time more slowly. When he finished, he simply stared at the page. Wyatt felt no satisfaction watching it happen, no desire for revenge. Only understanding. Harold had never intended to punish anyone. He had simply chosen someone he trusted. Several days later, the legal transfers were completed. The partnership officially passed to Wyatt Brooks. News spread quickly across Montana. Reporters called. Investors requested meetings. Business leaders offered opportunities. Wyatt declined most of them. Instead, he drove back into the mountains. Weeks later, construction began on a new project near the old cabin. Not a private estate, not a luxury retreat. A veterans resource center surrounded by open land and hiking trails. Nearby, another building was dedicated to retired military working dogs. On opening day, dozens of veterans arrived. Some came with families, others came alone. Every one of them was welcomed. As the sun lowered behind the mountains, Wyatt stood on the porch of the restored cabin. Shadow lay beside him, watching the distant tree line. The old $1 bill now rested inside a simple wooden frame hanging above the fireplace. Not because of what it had been worth, because of what it had revealed. Reeves stepped onto the porch holding 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Wyatt. Harold would have liked this. Wyatt smiled. I think he planned it this way. Reeves looked toward Shadow. The German shepherd had already fallen asleep. And the dog? Wyatt laughed softly. The dog probably knew before any of us. The mountains glowed gold beneath the evening light. Wind moved gently through the pines. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Some people inherit money, some inherit land. But the greatest inheritance Harold left behind was a reminder that character still matters. Loyalty still matters. And sometimes the people who seem to receive the least are the ones entrusted with the most. Beside him, Shadow slept peacefully. And for the first time in many years, so did Wyatt's heart. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and share it with friends who might enjoy it too. We would love to know where you are watching from. Tell us your city and country in the comments. More heartfelt and unforgettable hero dog stories are already waiting for you. See you in the next one.